So I just want to thank you all for being here. Montclair is my second home. I live in Newark, but my kids go to school here. And it's just an honor to be on stage with Dr. Elizabeth Alexander, who's going to read a little bit from her book, and then we'll jump into the conversation. So thank you.
Great, and I am so happy to be here with you in the long conversation, and also happy to be in Montclair with some of my wonderful colleagues from the Mellon Foundation who are here, as well as one of my college roommates is here, and perhaps most importantly, this is a town dear to me because my brother Mark and his family lived here for many years, and I've already heard from many people who love him and are pissed off that he left. So thank you for letting me know all those things. And it is wonderful to be back in Montclair. So I am going to read okay. This is from the middle of the book. And I'm just going to read. The kids got shot and the grown-ups got shot, which is to say the kids watched their peers shot down and their parents' generation get gunned down and beat down and terrorized as well. The agglomerating spectacle continues. Here are a few we know less well: Danny Ray Thomas, Johnny Jermaine Rush, Nania Kane, Dejuan Hall, Tatiana Jefferson, Demetrius Brian Hollins, Jacqueline Craig, and her children, and then the iconic Alton Sterling, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, Walter Scott, Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile. I call the young people who grew up in the past 25 years the Trayvon Generation. They always knew these stories. These stories formed their worldview. These stories helped instruct young African Americans about their embodiment and their vulnerability. These stories were primers in fear and futility. The stories were the ground soil of their rage. The stories instructed them that anti-Black hatred and violence were never far. They watched these violations up close and on their cell phones so many times over. They watched them in near real time. They watched them crisscrossed and concentrated. They watched them on the school bus. They watched them under the covers at night. They watched them often outside of the presence of adults who loved them and were charged with keeping them safe in body and soul. This is the generation of my sons, now 24 and 22 years old, and their friends, who are also children to me, and the students I have taught and mentored and loved. And this is also the generation of Darnella Frazier, the 17-year-old Minneapolis girl who came upon George Floyd's murder in progress while on an everyday run with her cousin to the corner store on May 25th, filmed it on her phone, and posted it to her Facebook page at 1:46 a.m. with the caption, "They killed him right in front of Cup Foods over South on 38th and Chicago." No type of sympathy.
Thank you for writing that, and thank you for sharing that with us. So this started off as an essay in the New Yorker, and I guess I just wanted to talk to you about like how you wrote it, what the process was like. It was pretty quick in terms of coming out of you or pouring out of you. And you give us a kind of a description there of what the Trayvon Generation means to you, but if you want to describe it a little bit more for us.
Well, you know, at that time when George Floyd was killed, and when, of course, as we all remember, we had been locked down in pandemic, suffering and watching, among other things, the disproportionate toll the COVID-19 pandemic took on poor people and Black and brown people. And then, you know, George Floyd again, as with the Trayvon Generation, it's the repeated seeing on the cell phones. And you know, I've been asking for a long time since I wrote about people watching the Rodney King videotape. What does it mean for Black people to witness? What does it mean to take this in? You know, taking it back even to Emmett Till and his mother's choice to bring the body to Chicago, to leave the casket open, to let Jet Magazine photograph it and circulate it. How do we think about these changing technologies of seeing our violation and the instructiveness, but also the cost and the toll of it? So, everything came to a very, very intense head, obviously, at that moment, with people also coming out to protest, coming out around the world in the midst of the pandemic to say that this was wrong. And what I found I was able to pull together really was the intensity of the moment, but also things I had been thinking about for a long time, and in my years as an educator, teaching. The creativity, the art, the poetry, the film, the music, the ways in which Black people have responded to our condition, as long as we've been here, right? But thinking in particular for this generation, what are they giving us? And also, what do we have to offer? So if I have a Lucille Clifton to offer, right, they have a Kendrick Lamar to offer, and trying to bring those things together in the same space.
So I remember I interviewed Elizabeth at the time for the New York Times when you were writing this essay, or at least it was about to be published, because you mentioned a very seminal essay that you wrote that was really important for me as an undergrad and then as a graduate student. And I don't want to mix up the name, but Can You Be Black and Look at This?
Yes.
A reading of the Rodney King video. And so I guess, and we talked about, and you just mentioned, this kind of the repetition of Black death in the public sphere and the ways in which technologies mediate that death differently for non-Black Americans as they may for Black Americans. So I was curious, did you see yourself as the Rodney King generation in contrast to the Trayvon generation, or how did you see your coming of age with this spectacle of Black death? Like, what was the formative moment maybe for you that's different for?
That's a great question, and I've been thinking about this question of generation. And I think that in some ways, perhaps we think of ourselves as a generation when there is something to really potently identify with.
Yeah.
So certainly what happened with Rodney King as a moment in the popular culture marked me tremendously, I would say, along with the Senate confirmation hearings of Clarence Thomas.
Yes, exactly.
And watching how Anita Hill was treated in that, and thinking, again, both of these people older than me, but thinking about, as a Black woman, what did it mean to speak the truth of your violation? What did it mean to come outside of, the silence that race is supposed to cloak over us, and that it's, to overwrite gender, and to keep us from telling our truths? And to watch that played out, and to also watch Anita Hill's dignity throughout that. I mean, just uncanny, right? These years later, to watch the confirmation hearing of Ketanji Brown Jackson. So we could talk about all of that. But so I would say that, but in neither of those did I necessarily feel that something was literally at stake for me, although Anita Hill certainly catalyzed a lot of my public Black feminism, being part of African American women in defense of ourselves, and thinking that it was important to speak in a larger way. So I don't exactly know what I asked, my father is 88, and I remember when I was writing about Emmett Till, and I said, is that your generation? And he said, well, because I was from New York and we didn't have people in the South, and because I was a little bit older, it didn't speak to me in that way. He said, Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers, as another, my father being, a race man, Medgar Evers being a race man, and being, murdered in front of his children. He said, that's what keeps me up at night.
Wow.
That's what was my marker. So I don't exactly know what mine is, but I can tell you that as a mother, trying to raise these young people, and also considering myself humbly a mother to more people, because this is how I am, and because I bring them around the table, and because I've just taught for so very, very, very long. So just kind of feeling like everybody's 19, they're just all going to stay 19. So really thinking about how do you, when you have young Black boys, how do you talk to them about Trayvon Martin? How do you talk to them about Tamir Rice? How do you teach them how to be safe? It goes beyond even just show your hands, keep your, have your documents visible. How do you talk to them about this? But how do we also put it in a longer historical precedent? So again, going back to my father, who I write about quite a bit in this book, And, writing about him as an 8-year-old in Harlem in his first negative encounter with the police.
Yeah.
And what his mother taught him was, you have to work very hard in school so you're very good at math. Why do you have to be very good at math? Because you need to get out of that encounter with the policeman safely, but come home to me with his badge number memorized. Don't come back without his badge number memorized. That's why you have to be good at math. So, I think that putting all of these things together and thinking about, I think what we all want for our young people, which is we want freedom, we want power, we want joy, we want them to figure it out, we want them to be smart, we want them to be glorious, we want them to be filled up. I want them to dance, I want them to sweat, I want them to be naughty, I want them to have fun, I want them to be brilliant, I want them to be righteous. They are all those things. But I want them safe, I want them alive, and I don't want them so fearful that they are paralyzed. And what I see in this generation and what I'm concerned about and what I look for in the art is that I think they are suffering.
Okay. No, well, I guess I wanted to talk, a lot of this book is I have a lot of alliteration, I think, in terms of alliteration, but mothering, as you pointed out, there's a really beautiful scene, and I don't know if you want to read it, in which you talk about a friend of yours having a dream. Do you want to read it? And then we
I'd
can
love
talk?
to read that, yeah.
It's so good you know where things are in your book. That's great.
It's short.
Yeah.
Every black mother I know is exhausted in her own way. I think every black mother must dream her fears about our children. I cannot write my dreams for fear they will come true if I speak them into form. One friend tells me of a dream she had where she was flying in an old-fashioned twin plane with her teenage son. They were flying in tandem until she was suddenly ejected from the plane seat and fell to the ocean below. She looked up and saw her son continue to fly while the pieces of her side of the plane broke off, wings, engine, body. He continued to fly the half plane, but she knew it could not support him. Her desperation was animal and wild. I pushed my body through the air to try to reach him, she tells me, and then the dream ended. Or black mothers are not dreaming because we are so exhausted that the dream space is without language or image, just darkness. If black children belong to us, and we need not be mothers or fathers or even black for black children to belong to us, a part of us is always vigilant and always exhausted. In spring, just a little bit more, I listen to communities of birds from my New York window, high above any treetops. They are migrating birds, a friend tells me, and some have come from as far as South America. She tells me that such birds have 2-chambered brains that allow them to sleep as they fly. This is what it means to sleep with one eye open. I feel there is no better metaphor for the never rest of people who love and take responsibility for black children, and especially black mothers.
So one of the ways in which I guess the article becomes a book is that you're looking backwards and you're moving forwards, right? And so I guess I wanted to talk a bit, there's a 2-part question. One, the tradition of black mothering, which I think you show in ways, I've read other pieces of yours in which you're also talking about that, but that you're kind of locating black mothering as this kind of urgent practice that's inexhaustible, that just is ongoing, and this restlessness that one has to have, as you talked about just now with keeping one eye open. Can you just talk a little bit, because this is a book about Trayvon Generation, but it is really a book, in another way of thinking about it, it's an ode to black mothers who have to mothering as a radical practice in the face of white supremacy. And so if you want to talk about how, I know you couldn't separate yourself from the book, but that do you see black mothering, what's the tradition that you're trying to map maybe in the book, or consciously or even subconsciously?
Well, I love that as an observation, so I don't have too much to add to it. I mean,
Okay.
that's fantastic. So, I mean, first I'll say a little bit about, writing. I mean, the essay is the centerpiece of the book, but what it meant to
Yeah.
actually make a book out of it.
Yeah.
So as you say, in the first section, I built out thinking about history, thinking about exactly that history you describe, and also a history of debased images of Black people in this country, and about language that I think in recent years has been used for violent purposes instead of to ennoble and simply to name, which I think is the most elevated and important purpose of language. And how in the face also of the violence of the lies about history. So I talk about, the great John Hope Franklin and a textbook that he was commissioned to write for the state of California in the 1960s that was not, he's of course, as you all know, renowned for his African American history textbook From Slavery to Freedom. But he was commissioned to write an American history textbook in which he put the experiences of everybody in the textbook, and immediately a committee was formed that put out a total disinformation campaign against him, saying that he was trying to make white people feel guilty for talking about the civil rights movement, for talking about Black accomplishments, that he was anti-American, that he was a communist, absolutely in keeping with the madness around so-called critical race theory that we're seeing right now. So, what does it mean to lie about American history? And efforts to restore that and to do that differently. Always thinking about, because I think one of the things I'm very excited about in the book is that in addition to having poems woven throughout by great writers in this radical Black mothering tradition like Lucille Clifton and Gwendolyn Brooks, but also visual art.
Yep.
Because I wanted it to be a book that you read the words and you paused with the images. And maybe you went back to the image before, and sometimes the images are illustrative, and sometimes the images are contrapuntal to make you have a different sort of thinking. So that kind of historical movement, talking also about Confederate monuments and erased history, is what's in the first section. And then at the end, I try to look to the future, but I'm really asking the question, hey, here, I've been offering you culture, I've been telling you what history illuminates, I've been showing you art, I've been listening to what the younger generation has to tell us, but is that enough to keep us safe? And so at that moment in the book, that's where I go to Angola prison, one of the most desperate places in the United States in my own experience, and talk about that, and then try to move us forward to what I at first thought might be a truly uplifting ending, but that wasn't where it ended up.
Yeah. So let's talk about the journey, because you're talking about it here, and just there's a part of me that just wants to geek out and talk about form and structure, and I will do some of that. But I was curious how you approach. So was that you take us back in the past, and then we're in the present, and then there's an attempt to kind of go back in the past a little bit, but then go forward, and then, it's not triumphalist because we're in the moment that we're in. But what was it like to kind of have this essay as the centerpiece? Is that normally how you write? And then you usually write, and then we may see an essay that's taken from the book, but we don't usually see the essay as the spine of the entire, or maybe I'm wrong, but it doesn't seem like that's your typical practice.
It was definitely its own experience, and a very, 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 very hard book to write. Because I think a book written in the middle of so many things happening with such intensity in the world around us. But also, I was very grateful for the anchor. I mean, you and I have not dissimilar trainings that I think sometimes send us back to close reading in the object. It's okay, if I analyze what's happening in this work of art, or in this poem, or in this amazing, amazing music video, or whatever it might be, then I can, I can let it show me something, and I can then shine that light back to help me write forward. So that was really the kind of ongoing old-fashioned methodology that also was very much tied to teaching. And so since I'm not teaching anymore, I think that I probably felt like, even though I didn't think of it when I was making it, that this is a little teaching book.
And what the essay was so poignant, because when the essay comes out and you're like, oh, I didn't think of this art that's coming out in this particular moment as a Trayvon. I mean, I think of it as Black Lives Matter, which is another way of saying Trayvon Generation. But I think by calling it the Trayvon Generation, you're getting us to think about this idea of trauma, suffering, the way in which, the children are watching it on the video in their room, in a private moment, and so how that creates even a stronger sense of isolation. at the same time, they're watching these videos, they're part of millions of people watching, but there's something about the intimacy of the cell phone that creates a deeper sense of isolation or alienation. So how do you watch all these shows? Like, I watch them a lot.
Yes,
Okay.
I watch TV.
I know.
I actually watch a lot of TV.
Okay, oh, that's good to know. So do I. Okay.
I love TV.
Yeah, because it was like nice to think about Insecure and Atlanta and Kendrick Lamar and Flying Lotus. I mean, it was just a really beautiful constellation of artists that you were working through, and that they're teaching us how to understand this moment, and they're able to teach people older than them, like you and me, how we can understand and maybe work through this moment together too.
Well, absolutely, and you know, at the end of the day, the book is really a call for multi-generational exchange and listening. And really, one of the main theses is that there is no progress, there is no movement, there is no forwardness unless it is multi-generational. So, you know, it's not quite just like, listen to the young folks and let them show the way, you know, but it's like, and here we have this to offer. So in the person, you know, in some of the popular culture, I mean, what I was thinking about in Insecure and Atlanta and in Kendrick Lamar was a kind of a, you know, what on the surface is described as a kind of black hipster, you know, maybe ennui, you know, a certain kind of culture, but actually I think it's a depressive black youth culture. I think it's a traumatized black youth culture. You know, I wanted to understand what is the affect of these young people and how also have they made, in the case of Kendrick, you know, I think about like, you know, We Gonna Be All Right in the way that it is both an anthem, it's a party song. It's a great party song, and I really do believe in black fest, black celebration, black joy, black embodiment through dancing, black community through dancing. I think that is crucially important. I mean, you know, I think about the amazing, amazing scene in Beloved, in the clearing. You know, love thyself, for yonder they do not love you. Love thy hands, love thy body, love thy liver. For yonder they will noose your neck. So what does it mean to come together in the circle of light in black community and be embodied and joyful together? I actually think that is why we are here. I mean, there are many other reasons, but I do think that is truly one of the reasons we are here. So when I say black anthem, black joy, I think that actually that has a lot of stakes. And also, as we know, We Gonna Be All Right is a protest song. So that was, you know, something that people were saying when they were in the act of protest. And when I also think of it as a mantra and a declaration and a speech act, we gonna be all right, we gonna be all right, we gonna be all right, we gonna be all right. I think that's a very powerful way to kind of unpack what's happening in that song. And then when you look at the video, if you recall, there are the impossible moments of the young black man flying above the neighborhood, you know, walk, walk, fly. But then when he is high, the police are aiming a gun at him. But then when he falls, there's that incredible moment at the end when we think he's been shot, but the policeman, it's a finger, it's not a gun. And the black young man opens his eyes. But it's not a hopeful place to end. Or with the director, Hiro Murai, you know, who of course also is an amazing director on Atlanta. But looking at the work he did with Flying Lotus, and I love Flying Lotus's work anyway, but I have to say I also love that he takes us back to Alice Coltrane. That's his aunt. And that, you know, the kind of long traditions of what people are listening to and making music from that is particularly rich in that LA scene with people like Kamasi Washington and others, you know, that's a very kind of crisscrossed scene. I really love that. But so, you know, for Before the Quiet comes, and then the other film where, you know, it starts out with a funeral, black children in a hearse, and then in the imagination of the artists, the children leap out of the casket and are brought back to life, and they dance down the aisle, but the people in the pews cannot see them. So are their spirits, are they coming back to life, or are their spirits leaving? And you're experiencing their joy, you're experiencing their life force and their beauty. And then at the end, you know, these kids are maybe, what, 8? They get in a car and drive, and it's a moment of exhilaration where you think like, oh my God, these kids, they're not supposed to be driving. And they're driving in a hearse, and they're driving in their own hearse. You know, so I mean, I just like the layers and depths of feeling. You know, I just feel like my generation is not making that art. So I feel like we have to learn from that art. So that a long answer to like, yes, I looked at it and watched it and thought about it,
No.
and I think it's really extraordinary. And I wanted it in conversation, with Lucille Clifton.
Yeah. And I was just thinking about this idea of this depression, the depression that's surrounding both the artists and the children or the young people consuming it. And then my generation with hip hop, we were like rage, which is a different articulation or a different maybe response, external response to the same problem. So I was just thinking of rage and depression and the distinction between those two things. The other, like you mentioned this in the beginning, but monuments. And so I'm interested in this book, both examining what it means to be a witness and then contending with history. And I know in terms of Mellon, there's been a lot of really important work, really, really radical work in terms of rethinking American monuments and the way in which they kind of lord over us and what that means. But here you open also with a different but similar gesture of the role of the monument, but then you're also thinking of the artist as the one who's bearing witness. So can you just talk a little bit about, there are ways in which monuments kind of ossify the past, and then the artist as the one who really is bearing witness to history. And so is there a distinction, or do we think of the artist as a monument maker that's doing a kind of different monument for us? Or I was just curious about.
Yeah. Well, I think I've been thinking and working so much on monuments over the last few years, and so at the Mellon Foundation, our work on the Monuments Project is the biggest initiative that we've ever undertaken. Thinking about how the American built environment tells and doesn't tell the story of who we are. What are all the stories of who we are that very crucially are told as any of us walks around in public space. So I think what's deep about monuments is that we encounter them every day. We don't often have to pay to see them. They're ambient. And we feel small before them. We feel that something very, very important is being said. And so then when I started to look, for example, at the preponderance of Confederate monuments. Confederate monuments in places where Confederates never set foot. Confederate monuments mostly erected decades and decades and decades and decades and decades up close to the present in places after the Civil War, after the Confederates lost, right? These victorious, monuments that are outside of the context of the fighting of the war are about white supremacy in stone, in the space of Stone Mountain, outside of Atlanta, Georgia, the largest bas-relief sculpture in the world, the largest memorial to the Confederacy in the world, a place built by the Klan, a place where the Klan has their revels, and a place that is one of the biggest attractions. I'm actually going to go see it next week, and it's an amusement park. People recreate there. And so I have
in the hometown of Donald Glover as well.
In the hometown of Donald Glover, in the hometown of Kara Walker, who I talk about in the book, who says that Stone Mountain was the most influential thing on her art. And that she was able to answer with a piece that I reproduce in the book that's now at the High Museum. She said she wouldn't come back to Atlanta until she could answer Stone Mountain. Natasha Trethewey, so many black artists writing against this monstrosity. And so, thinking about, when you don't have those big stone monuments, how do you keep your history? How do you remember? How do you honor? And I look at how that takes place, especially in the space of black poetry, which I think has taken very seriously the responsibility for naming and remembering. And though not made of stone, poems are forever. And so the poems of people like Trethewey and Clifton, stand forever. I'm also very interested in vernacular monuments, in the ways that people, like I talk about a roadside memorial to Sandra Bland, that people make and keep. I have a section, I write a lot about New Haven. Maybe I could read a little piece from this, about the ways that we remember in form. So in this, I've lived many, many years of my life in New Haven, and this is about driving down, some of you will know, Dixwell Avenue. I'm going to just take this cover, this beautiful cover, Carrie Mae Weems, Blue Black Boy, and I'll put it out. And you'll notice, by the way, little metallic blue on the spine. The book designers did a really beautiful job. Black communities are, well, actually here. I talk about coming upon a crowd down Dixwell Avenue. I soon saw that hundreds of people were clustered outside and pouring into a black church among so many on Dixwell. It was an arresting tableau because most of the crowd were wearing bright goldenrod hoodies over or instead of formal funeral clothes. As I inched by, I saw that on the front of those hoodies was a picture of a smiling young black man, 15 or 16 by my guess. The young man was the reason they gathered. He was the boy who had died. Black communities are full of people wearing t-shirts and hoodies with the faces of young black people on them whom their communities mourn and remember. I do not know more about this boy or this story or how he died, but this is one way black people live, die, and are mourned in New Haven. History is marked by what was there and is no longer, and it is kept by the ways we remember. We honor our beloved who too often live abbreviated lives and die for reasons related to race by calling their names and wearing their faces on our bodies. In literal cemeteries, bodies are buried and the places carry the memory of the ritual farewells that have occurred there, where we weep and hear the sounds of shovels breaking dirt in 4 seasons. Then we mark the ground with headstones to make places to return to. Over the years, cemeteries themselves tell stories and become history. And I go from there to tell a story of Zora Neale Hurston, who of course, we know and teach through her great novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God. But I focus again to the close reading and the small on a letter that she wrote to W.E.B. Du Bois, where she said, why I think we should make a cemetery for the illustrious Negro dead, so that we will be remembered. One place in Florida where Frederick Douglass and Nat Turner and Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth will be buried in a beautiful place that we can go and visit. And she does a whole beautiful thing about like Florida's plant life and what kind of artists can make sculptures and make this cemetery for the illustrious Negro dead. And Du Bois writes back cursorily and without much interest. And the irony, of course, is that Hurston herself died in a state of penury, unremembered, and it took the writer Alice Walker to go and find her unmarked grave in a weedy field and erect a stone that said Zora Neale Hurston, Genius of the South. So I think these stories about artists taking the responsibility for remembering is really what you're talking about.
It's interesting to just think of Hurston anticipating, in a way, an anonymity, or trying to stave off that in that moment. There's another, Du Bois comes across better in another part of your book. When someone,
he was complicated.
Yes, he was complicated. When someone, it's a beautiful meditation on Black humanity and the ways in which, there's an exchange and they're asking if Black people shed tears, and he just writes another quick response that we shed tears, and this idea of insisting on these very quotidian natures of what it means to be a human being that Black people get asked over and over again, and then we have to constantly prove that we are in fact human.
And if I could just say, just to even put a finer point on that, this was a letter that was written to W.E.B. Du Bois in 1905 by a scientific researcher who wrote and said, "Does the Negro shed tears?" A serious question. Yeah.
Thank you. Does the audience get a chance to? Okay, good. So I want to just, I have so many more questions for you, but I will ask just one and turn it over. But I do want to say, as a reader, and this is again like the very small but important point, I just love the way in which you incorporate artists' voices. In academic training we would get overburdened with the footnote. Yeah. But one of the things I've learned from you as a writer is just to, you incorporate Lucille, it's such a seamless incorporation of other voices so that the narrative it flows so easily, even though you're taking us out of your voice into the voice of someone else. So it's just a really beautiful experience to read your work, and I just want to thank you for that. And I have a question, but the other thing I'd like to say is I also thought of Citizen a lot with this book because I thought it was maybe a different approach to incorporating visual text, right? So that you said earlier, that these works of art that are appearing in your book, sometimes you talk about them, you do a close reading, and other times they kind of appear as a moment for us to meditate next to your words, or maybe even transport us out of the book itself. And so if you get to, it's a very beautiful book in terms of curation. And obviously you have your work done that, but I was just curious what that, and then I have a quote to read and then we can open it up to everyone.
Yeah, no, I mean, Claudia Rankin and I are absolutely sort of side by side in career. So she's a peer and sister in the work, and definitely, Citizen is a cousin. In my own practice, it goes back even further to that Rodney King essay and all of the artists who are included within it. And again, in sort of mirroring a teaching process, though a literature professor, always putting that literature in the context of what were the poets saying to the to the painters, saying to the musicians, and what did history have to say to all of that? And that's a kind of primary modality in how I think about life.
And it's just a really strong case studies for African American studies.
Yes.
As a reading and as a reading practice, as a pedagogical experience, and as an interdisciplinary world. So thank you for that. There's this, I'm similar to you, I'm a zealot for the artist as the, as a witness, but also as the person who's able to create radical change in our society. And so you have this really, I just want to read it. I thought you read your stuff so well, so I'm not going to read it as well as Elizabeth.
Please do.
So she says, artists make radical solutions all day, soup from a stone, beauty from thin air. We see and try and discard and see again. We vision, we discard, we invent. We do it in the dark, we bring it into community. Artists continue to generate in a dangerous world that is nonetheless overflowing with life force and power. Creativity, making, and imagining animate Black self-determination with that which only culture can provide. And so I just wanted to ask you, if when you believe in the power of art to transform the world, it's almost like second nature. But I just wanted you to talk a little bit about what it is that you mean in terms of the artist being able to vision beyond where we are. And I know you're an artist and you're steeped in the world of artists, but I guess it's always an endless point to be made over and over again. So this book is a tribute to that as well. So.
Well, thank you so much for reading it out loud, because I was like, that is the truth right there. It was nice hearing you read it. But that's what I mean, right? That's what I said. And I think that my hope with every work I do, if it's in a classroom, if it's with the incredible, thinkers and artists and doers who we support at Mellon, if it is in what I hope the experience people will have from reading this book, expose yourself to the superpower and you will get it. Punto e basta. Yeah, I really do think that. I really do.
Okay, great, thank you. Go ahead.
Hand raise, please.
Would love your questions and comments.
Hi, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been really important. I do have a question that really relates to what's been happening, I guess, post-George Floyd in some of the work environments where you're seeing Black women especially kind of speak up and also resign from positions. And if we look at what happened with Nicole Hannah-Jones as well, it's really connected. And so I'm just interested to hear from both of you, actually, your thoughts on how this conversation regarding the Trayvon generation translates to Black women in the workplace.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I guess what I would say, and I want to hear what you have to say too, is I think that the hard work that the culture is in the midst of, not just post George Floyd, is what does it mean? Was real power sharing look like? What does it really, really look like? What does fairness really, really look like? What do different assumptions around leadership? How do those translate into the workplace? What does it mean to lead without a scarcity model? Right? What does it mean to do that? What does it look like? And even when change is positive, it can sometimes make people feel uneasy, because falling into hierarchies, even if we resist it, is what we are used to, right? Even if dad's not there, dad's supposed to be there, right? You know, and so who's in the dad? I'm putting all of this in quotation marks, right? So I think that, you know, and I think that when you look, I mean, presidential politics don't tell you everything, but they tell you a strand of something. So when you look at Trump's being elected and the comfort with the raging patriarch that the country chose, right? You know, it all sort of trickles down. So I think what we're in the midst of the pains for, but I have great hope about it, is what it means to really share power and to really think about community functioning in healthier and mutually empowering kinds of ways.
Thank you. It's a really good and complicated question. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot is, you know, these kind of parallel, America's always like, you know, founding paradox always has these competing histories coexisting. And you have these really unprecedented moments for Black women in the public sphere and politics, you know, in terms of the White House press secretary or Supreme Court or vice president, right? We have these really remarkable moments of Black women being seen and recognized. Obviously having to have triple the work and, you know, exceed all expectations and surpass them and still be vilified, but still you have this really important moment in which a few are being recognized, and it's historically important. And then you have these moments and these like, kind of inflection points that you were talking about with Nikole Hannah-Jones, and the way in which the 1619 Project becomes a stand-in for all of these really contentious ways in which people are trying to bottle up American history and ossify it the way the monuments did. And so she, in fact, becomes both someone who's trying to, you know, take off the veil and then gets punished for it. So so that's happening, I think, and it's happening in a really the backlash against critical race theory, which for academics is really kind of a weird, you know, like, I don't know how to explain why it's like that has been renamed and circulated as something that, in fact, it's an umbrella for so many things, and therefore it's so easily attacked as a result. But I have another way I would like to answer your question too. I recently did a conversation with two scholars, Farah Jasmine Griffin and Soyika Colbert. We were responding to Dominique Morisseau's play, The Confederates. And in that play, there are two main characters, an enslaved woman who is trying to seek freedom on a plantation, and an academic, a Black woman who is a tenured professor, but is being squeezed from all of these different sides, from a Black male student, a white female student, a white woman student, and then another Black colleague, a woman colleague of hers. And so I guess with Nikole Hannah-Jones, like, outside of it, there were like these pictures of like Kimberly Crenshaw and Nikole Hannah-Jones, and so and this is like something we were talking about in the panel. Like in no other moment was the Black woman academic an archetype, and yet now we have this moment which Nikole Hannah-Jones both represents, and she's a journalist who's obviously now in the academy, but that there's all this interesting, like whether it's the chair, it's an essay I think I would like to write. There's all this, like all these other television shows and the movie The Master, which is kind of playing on, have you seen that movie yet? You should see it, because it's based on Yale, but different, I suppose. Yeah, and so.
Is it new?
Yeah, it just came out. It's on Amazon. But anyway, the woman in Macbeth we were talking about earlier, she's also in that movie.
Oh, let's watch that.
Yeah, and Regina Hall stars in it, and she's an academic. So there's this weird way in which the Black woman academic, who again we've been, writing away, like invisible to our institutions, is now an archetype. And I think it's again this notion of the way an African American, the generation that grew up with African American studies, or two generations that have grown up with African American studies, are now the artists and the creators, and so some of them are investigating this, and I think Nikole Hannah-Jones also represents that other interest that people are suddenly having in the archetype of the Black woman academic. So
interesting.
Yeah, it's really kind of weird. So I mean, it's sure.
Thank you both, and thank you for the reminder that the reaction that if we tell a broader history, white people might be insulted or feel that they're racists. I thought I heard that before. Thanks for the reminder that that's from the 60s.
I think I didn't say that, but please keep going.
There was a comment that in the 60s, when the scholar who wrote the book, that there was disinformation, that
Yes.
the campaign that white people might feel.
Yes.
Yeah, so I thought that sounded familiar. When you were speaking about the art that you've been seeing, you said that, I believe you said that this generation is suffering. You can see the suffering. The trauma is not new. What do you see that's different than prior generations of artists?
Yeah, what I think is different is that I think the repeated consumption of the violence with phone. This is not a social media is bad, cell phones are bad. This is simply describing the way that the violence has been taken in and witnessed. The cell phone is part of your body. It's in your hand, and 25 times, 100 times, you're watching Laquan McDonald get shot from behind in a Chicago street. You're watching Tamir Rice get shot in 2 seconds outside the gazebo. You're watching George Floyd get murdered in a video taken by a 17-year-old at close range, watching 4 police officers murder a man. Which, I mean, I just want to say, Darnella Frazier, who is that child? Who is that child? So I do think that is the new thing, and that also often it's consumed outside of a context of being able to talk about it. I mean, again, in my own experience and the experience of many, the kids come home from school and they've already seen it 50 times on the school bus. And so you can't, it's not like the One Jet magazine is on the coffee table and the family is talking about it together. So I do wonder that has its effect.
And I guess to add to that, there's an interesting film called Love Song for Latasha that was it's a short film on Netflix. It was nominated for an Oscar. And again, it's like this bridge between my generation and the contemporary one. Sophia Nalia Allison is the director, and she's looking at this moment in 1992 when Latasha Harlins was brutally murdered in Los Angeles at the age of 14 years old. She goes into a grocer in her neighborhood. She's buying orange juice, and she's murdered by the owner of the grocery store. And so in the history, it's also seen as a catalyst for the LA rebellion of 1992. But somehow she's kind of fallen out of history, even though I think she's also remembered in LA. But what's important about that film that speaks to, I think, what Elizabeth is talking about, she recreates Latasha's life, and Latasha Harlins would have been 40, my age, 40, same age as me. She recreates her life through the voices of her best friend and her cousin, but the director refuses to include the footage of Latasha Harlins being murdered. So it's an interesting response, I think, to an artist who is in this moment of hyper-consumption of these videos of Black death and recreates her life without including this deeply disturbing moment of Black loss and Black death. And so it's an interesting...
That's so great. I'm glad you mentioned that, and I would also put that along the very, very important Fruitvale Station.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that was a film that was about the life of Oscar Grant, who was murdered in the Oakland Fruitvale Station transit station, another videotaped and widely circulated story. Mm. And so in Fruitvale Station, which, I mean, also just with the convergence of art and what was happening in the world, 2012, Trayvon Martin is murdered by George Zimmerman. 2013, George Zimmerman is acquitted, and at that time, Fruitvale Station is out, which gives us a day in the life of Oscar Grant. And it's not you, and what's so deep about that movie is that if you even have read anything about it before, you know that you're getting to, you're going to see the murder at the end. And at the end of the 2 hours, and I would imagine if you follow anybody in that kind of detail, You know, he wakes up, this is his mood, this is his shower, this is his kid, he's picking up groceries for his mom, he's fussing with his girlfriend, you know, all of the things that happen in anybody's life in one day. If you spend a day, an intimate day with any human being, you will know that human being. And so the loss is so devastating at the end of that film. So I think that they're wonderful companions.
No, it's really beautiful. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you.